Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Regulatory Requirements and Technology. Are your firm's practices consistent with the new rules? My name is Dalia Valdevate. I'm the Director of Marketing at Lumesis, and I will be your moderator today. Due to the high volume of participants, the audio Q&A feature will be disabled for the webinar. We encourage you to interact by typing in your questions and comments using the instant messaging feature. IM questions will be answered on a first-come, first-served basis at the end of the presentation. Please note today's PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to all attendees shortly after the webinar. I'd now like to introduce the speakers, Greg Dienstock, CEO and co-founder of Lumesis, who will cover the regulatory aspects, and Tim Stevens, President, COO, and co-founder, who will introduce our advisor solution. Thank you. The webinar will now begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar. This is Greg Dienstock, and I'm going to spend the first about 15-20 minutes or so walking through kind of a bit about municipal market regulation at a high level, and then drill in more specifically to our time of trade disclosure, suitability, and supervision. We'll then touch on some possible things that you can utilize, and then Tim Stevens will provide an introduction to our advisor platform, following which we'll have time for Q&A. And as Dahlia said, feel free to use the chat icon in the webinar setup to accomplish that. So what I thought I'd do is I'd start off with a quick perspective on muni regulation and an interesting quote that I found a little while ago that really sets the stage. And the quote reads in part, despite its past indiscretion, municipal security has spent the majority of its adult life viewed by professionals as the veritable nun of investments, hair yanked back beneath a white coif, frown lines etched into her permanently pursed lips. Investors did not suspect the tie-dyed socks municipal security kept hidden beneath her habit. For those of you not familiar with that quote, who don't read the review of banking and financial law, that's where that comes from. And the quote really reflects the view that the municipal market historically has been viewed as very stable and staid, and as a result, the subject of regulation. We do know that our brethren in the equity and corporate markets have been subject to much more significant regulation over time. The result of that is that there are technological efficiencies that are developed and deployed on the one hand to meet the requirements, but on the other hand to also enhance business practices. And that'll be a part and parcel of what we spend some time on today, is the idea of marrying the obligation to satisfy the regulatory obligation while also working with the business to enhance how they go about doing their jobs, making them more efficient and better in that regard. When we look at current activities in the municipal market where regulation has lagged the broader financial services market, we're seeing two things right now. One is you're seeing, especially by the MSRB, this desire to make rules, I think, more understandable, more easily understandable, create a level of consistency, whether you're looking at an MSRB rule or something from FINRA, so that market participants are getting a better sense of rules from a consistency perspective. The other thing that we're seeing, especially across the muni space, are new rules. And new rules are driven, I think, by a couple of things. One is the market evolution, which involves, obviously, more complex, is what we've seen over time, more complex offerings into the market space. The other driver of new rules and regulation are what I call market events and activity. What in conversations, what I've heard with others, really are more about bad behavior, perhaps bad disclosure. Certainly the financial crisis, which we experienced, and some could argue we might still be experiencing, that has led to the passage of Dodd-Frank, which 4 years later we're still waiting for implementation of certain aspects of Dodd-Frank. Because the muni space has lagged the broader financial services market, I believe that that is one of the reasons that there's also been limited technological innovation in our space. About 5 years ago, we're coming up on the 5-year anniversary, EMMA was introduced into the marketplace. And I think since that time, you've seen a number of new vendors come on the scene. The idea of trying to help folks address new regulation as it comes about, and that's where we'll kind of jump in now to our time of trade disclosure. While the time of trade disclosure rule is not necessarily new, in fact, the MSRB has gone out of its way to make sure we all understand that it's a codification of an old rule. And that old rule is Rule G-17, which is a principles-based rule. And it provides that in the conduct of its municipal securities or municipal advisory activities, each broker-dealer, municipal securities dealer, and municipal advisor shall deal fairly with all persons and shall not engage in any deceptive, dishonest, or unfair practice. The rule, written the way it was quite a while back, led to many questions, and those questions led to over 30 interpretive notices and letters. So I think ambiguity breeded the output of these additional pieces of guidance. What ended up happening over time is folks kind of looked at the guidance and in some cases were able to comply, and others weren't sure what exactly they were supposed to do, which led in 2010 both the MSRB and FINRA coming out with what they would categorize as reminder notices. As it relates to FINRA, I think folks came to know that Regulatory Notice 1041 more so as the, quote, checklist, which ultimately went from something that market participants were very upset about as categorizing as perhaps a new rules to more of just a best practices. Interestingly, what we heard lots of in the marketplace after 1041 came out and the MSRB's reminder notice was a concern from market participants, especially folks on the business side, who were concerned that with the introduction of the checklist and what was, I think, an effort at a level of clarification, that individual municipal bond trades could take up to, if not more than, 30 minutes per trade. And we heard some folks go so far as to saying if that was the case, they were going to contemplate backing away from what was otherwise considered a very good business for them, and instead directing clients to ETFs and funds. We fast forward, to where we are today, which is the new rule G-47, which, as I mentioned before, is a codification of those interpretive notices and letters. The rule itself was approved by the SEC in March of this year and will be effective on July 5th, which I believe is a Saturday. So I guess you get into work on Monday on the 7th, and you'll see that the rule is effective. As I mentioned, it is a codification, and the objective was to simplify. And the rule itself provides, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it essentially provides that you should not sell a municipal security to a customer or purchase a municipal security from a customer, whether unsolicited or recommended, primary or secondary, without disclosing to that customer at or before the time of trade all material information known about the transaction, as well as material information reasonably accessible to the market. And we're going to get into this a bit more in a moment. There's a second component to the rule that's captured in the supplementary material to the rule, and it specifically provides that dealers must implement processes and procedures reasonably designed to ensure that material information regarding municipal securities is passed on to registered representatives who are engaged in sales to and purchases from a customer. I'm going to get into a bit more detail around customers, about material information in a moment, but I think the important part here is to understand there are essentially two parts to your obligation here. First is getting the information to your representative and who interfaces with the customer. The customer in this case is going to be your retail customer or your non-SNMP. And then the second part of the equation is getting that information to that customer. Looking quickly now at the purpose of the rule. As I mentioned before, it's the consolidation of previously issued guidance, over 30 interpretive notices and letters, countless pages if you've had the chance to look through, single-spaced, not a lot of fun. A primary purpose, we've heard this from FINRA, you hear it from the SEC, you hear it from the MSRB, is protection of the retail and the non-sophisticated municipal market participant investor. So the definition of customer is not simply the retail customer. And then this last piece under the purpose I found rather interesting. It was cited by the MSRB and again cited by the SEC in its order approving the new rule. In the purpose being to ease the burden of dealers and others who endeavor to understand, comply, and enforce the rule. So I take by that the objective here again was simplification, codification, not only for you all on the phone and others, but also for the enforcement body responsible. Some noteworthy highlights of the rule, and I do think these are noteworthy while, again, it was a codification. I think there were some level of surprise when folks read the new rule, and that was reflected in the comments that were submitted over time. So the first is the rule applies not only to the sale to, but the purchase from. This was, I think, a surprise to many as demonstrated in the comment letter submitted by SIFMA, which we all had the opportunity to look at. The rule applies to both primary and secondary trades. We have heard it out in the marketplace, especially before the passage of the rule, that some skepticism as to whether or not the rule was applicable to primary trades as well as secondary trades. The rule applies to recommended and unsolicited orders. So whether the client's calling in and asking you to buy the bond, or alternatively if it's self-directed, there still is an obligation for communication of what are material information around the time of trade and disclosure. And then last but not least is facts material to assessing potential risks of an investment. So on the one hand, this is the idea of understanding what those risks are, whether they're interest rate risks or credit risks or liquidity risks, and then understanding what impacts those risks. So whether it's the idea that perhaps unemployment has risen in the area, or housing, or there's a pension funding issue, all factors that can be considered material to assessing the risk of an investment. Turning now to material information known about the transaction as well as reasonably accessible to the market. Information is deemed to be material if there's a substantial likelihood that the information would be considered important or significant by a reasonable investor in making an investment decision. So for example, information such as whether a bond can be redeemed before its maturity, specific features of a bond, for example, whether or not there's an original issue discount can be considered important, as well as other features or factors that can impact the price or yield. A non-exhaustive list is provided in the reg and is also available, as Talia said, we'll be making the presentation available to everyone following this conference call, and we've included that non-exhaustive list in the appendix, so you'll be able to see it there. The next point I wanted to make is a provision that was inserted into the supplementary materials of the rule, and this was, I think, in response to SIFMA's comment regarding the, quote, purchase from. And the language provides that whether the customer is purchasing or selling the municipal security may be a consideration in determining what information is material. So clearly when, whether a bond is callable, the fact that a bond has been called may be very important if your client is interested in selling a bond and perhaps the price may not be 100 cents on the dollar. A ratings action or ratings direction might also be very important. Prior trades, again, on the purchase from. So these are things just to contemplate, as the rule provides both a purchase for as well as a purchase from. The next aspect of the rule that I want to address for you is the idea of what is reasonably accessible to the market. The rule not only provides for the fact that EMA, perhaps rating agency reports or established industry sources suffice, and those industry sources will include other sources of information relating to municipal securities transactions. But the rule also makes clear that one must go beyond EMMA and rating reports. And this is where we believe, and others believe, that the impact of technology can be rather important and meaningful when it comes to both disclosure and transparency. And this was reflected not only by our thinking, but certainly by the MSRB and FINRA. And I'll just read to you quickly the MSRB notice, which stated that they expect that as technology evolves and municipal securities information becomes more readily available, new established industry sources are likely to emerge. Along those lines, we think, what is, quote, reasonably accessible has and will evolve. And I think a way to think about this in context of your own life is go back a year or two or three and think about what was available to you vis-a-vis the internet in terms of search capabilities, and then think about what information is available to you today and how that has evolved and continues to evolve. That concept and that construct, we think, is important as you think about what is reasonably accessible at or before the time of trade. To drive the point home one bit further, from FINRA's Regulatory Notice 1041, they make clear that firms should review their policies and procedures for obtaining material information about municipal securities. So the concept is something that's embedded already in FINRA's thinking. I want to shift gears now over to suitability, and you'll see in a moment the kind of the obvious connection here. When the SEC approved G-47, when the MSRB submitted G-47 for approval, they also submitted for approval, and the SEC approved, an amendment to MSRB Rule G-19, which is the suitability rule. And as most of us know, the suitability obligation is comprised of three parts. That is the reasonable basis component, customer specific, and the quantitative or churning aspect. And the amendment, and I'm really going to truncate this to really focus in on just the material change here, but the reasonable basis obligation requires reasonable diligence and also includes an understanding of information about the bond, including information described in MSRB Rule G-47, to the extent that information is material, which that last part, to the extent such information is material, seems a little bit redundant since the rule speaks to material information. Importantly, the rule goes on to say that the lack of such an understanding when recommending a bond or strategy violates the suitability rule. So this is important not only where the client is calling or you're reaching out to the client, but even where the firm or the advisor has discretion with regard to the account, it is still important that they have an understanding and demonstrate an understanding of all the component aspects and critical aspects of the specific bond. I want to move over now to an area which is essentially kind of a natural lead-in to, which is regarding supervision. And more specifically, that's MSRB Rule G-27, which is not updated, but it is really worth diving into here a bit. And then also FINRA Rule 3110, which recently came out and was really FINRA's objective of bringing together prior rules around supervision into one place. G-27 requires firms to supervise their municipal securities business and to ensure they have adequate policies and procedures in place for monitoring the effectiveness of their supervisory systems. And there are really three prongs to this. One is obviously the idea of supervising the conduct to ensure compliance with applicable rules. The second is simply having the written supervisory procedures, which I know virtually every firm has, and certainly all the firms that we speak with would certainly have those written supervisory procedures. And then it's the implementation of controls to ensure that their supervisory procedures are adequate. And that leaves a little bit to the imagination, but the idea of making sure that at the end of the day, conducting regular reviews to ensure that the transactions that your firm is conducting are in accordance with applicable rules. So in other words, are your supervisory procedures really able to kind of check to see that things that you say are to be done are in fact being done. I think an important comment to make here is around MSRB Notice 2010-37, which very explicitly said that firms should consider including in their procedures specific processes for documenting or otherwise ascertaining that such disclosures have been made. And we think that's important in the sense that while the new rule, G-47, doesn't say documentation is required, it is certainly something that one may want to take into serious consideration when you start to ask yourself certain questions such as, are your firm's practices compliant with your policies? In this regard, we think the means to support supervision and protect your firm is really where technology can come into play and be very beneficial to you. We think about here the idea of not only protecting the firm, but also creating that business efficiency. And that's where we think this idea of documentation is important. This last bullet, or a series of bullets on this page that we're looking at right now, really comes from a FINRA conference that we were at earlier this year, not attributed to a FINRA representative, but to a market participant, a rather senior person from a well-known firm, was up and went on and talked about the idea of the importance of documentation, and went so far as to say that he has heard that if you didn't document it, the question is, did it happen? And the importance, he went on to talk about that documentation supports your supervisory obligation, adherence to your supervisory obligation, as well as adherence to the underlying rules. I like to think of this in a slightly different way in terms of whether there's an interest, a FINRA arbitration, there's a claim made by a client perhaps, or you're doing your internal reviews, and the question is whether or not something was done. The idea of avoiding the he said, she said, and more appropriately being able to demonstrate that the firm fulfilled its obligations, we think is very important. So as you consider the supervisory obligations in conjunctions with the rules, I think some takeaway questions for you that are worth contemplating. And again, you don't have to rush to take notes on this. The presentation will be delivered by email to you shortly after. But the questions that I think about are, do those dealing with your retail and non-SMMP clients have real-time access to material information for communication to the client at or before the time of trade and for purposes of the suitability determination? I think the next question, which is really a subcomponent of the first, is the information current? So for example, if you're looking at a secondary trade, is the information from a report or from at the time when the bond was issued? And we know that that information can certainly turn very stale very quickly. Similarly, if there's a report that one is referring to, whether it's 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years old, is that going to contain the material information reasonably accessible with current information? That's going to be important to whether the time of trade disclosure or suitability. The next piece is one to contemplate more from a business standpoint. Is the information in one place for ease of use and delivery? The important aspect of, especially when the rule is codified and makes clear what needs to be disclosed, the idea of having efficient access to and use of that data for delivery to the client, we think is highly important. And then the last piece, when you think about your supervisory component here, is can you verify that the material information was disclosed, or in the case of suitability, at least considered at or before the time of trade? So I'm going to jump over now very quickly to some solutions that you might want to contemplate. First up here is Emma. I would also categorize under here perhaps Google. And this is really more of what I'll call the go-it-alone approach. We've heard certainly from market participants that using Emma and searching around trying to find information can take up to, if not more than, 30 minutes per trade. We think, if you're going to go to Emma, you do have the obligation to go beyond, so that's certainly a very realistic parameter that's been provided to us. We think that there's a risk, lack of a consistent approach within a firm where perhaps you're instructing people to go to Emma and perhaps check outside. The rule specifically, as I said, mentioned going beyond Emma. And then last, the question is, how do you support your supervisory aspect? The next thing to contemplate is the advisor platform, which Tim's going to spend a little bit of time on, so I'll just kind of very quickly mention that the idea of being able to generate a comprehensive bond report within a couple of seconds that is integrated into the workflow. And when I say integrated into the workflow, we have partnered with several of the ATSs, most notably TMC, TradeWeb, and BondDesk, and we are actively working with two others for integration, and that can go as far as the user firm is interested in, and we can talk about that outside of this call. And then the last piece is the idea from a supervisory standpoint, the ability to report and audit the activities that have been done. There are other tools in the marketplace. We are not aware of any of that have been designed, developed, and delivered for the purpose of addressing the time of trade disclosure. Many of them are fine products and do a very good job for their intended purpose. What we get concerned about when we've evaluated and looked at some of these with clients is what I call the square peg in the round hole, and the concern that they're not comprehensive, they're not complete, or they're not fully up to date. We think these are things that are really important to think about as you go through assessing your policies, procedures, and what's being done today. The other is whether or not they are efficient in terms of needing to go to multiple applications to gather the information. And last, whether or not they have a reporting mechanism to confirm for you that the policies and procedures were in fact met. I'm going to now turn it over to Tim Stevens, who is our COO and co-founder, and Tim is going to walk you through a little bit of the Diver platform, and then we'll jump back on and be available to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon to all of our webinar participants. We really do appreciate the opportunity today to briefly demonstrate how Diver Advisor can help you meet the regulatory requirements that were just reviewed by Greg. I'm about to show you how, in less than 2 seconds, the Diver application will generate a complete municipal bond report with the most current, up-to-date data from over 20 sources. Whether your users are accessing this through your ATS provider or directly from our web interface, all 1.1 million outstanding municipal bonds are available. Each evening, our list of available municipal CUSIPs is updated via a feed from the CUSIP Bureau with new municipal CUSIPs that were issued that day. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to turn over live to our website. We are now online. And what I'm going to do right away is I'm going to enter a new CUSIP, and you'll see how quickly a muni bond report generates. So what I've done is I've generated a municipal bond report for a Chicago O'Hare bond. And what I'd like to do is just kind of walk you briefly through some of the sections that are in the report. We start with terms and features. Many of these terms are specifically required by G-47. One that I'll point out is minimum denomination. That would have been a very helpful field, I'm sure, to several firms during Puerto Rico's last primary issuance, for example. Moving on down the report, you'll see there's redemption information, credit enhancement. There's information on the official statement, continuing disclosures. You might want to call this the EMMA section. Any default events associated with the issuer. News links. We have a proprietary database of over 5,100 newspaper links that we've linked directly to this individual CUSIP so that you can look up current news. Current credit ratings from Moody's and S&P. Price and yield information that's up to date and updated on a real-time basis. Again, just to reiterate, please note that either these items are either required or are being made reasonably accessible through this technology. Potential conflicts of interest. Our geolocation of the credit, including sector designation. Our GeoScore, which is actually a proprietary score that we create that looks at the economic health of a location in which we have assigned a municipal bond. Obligor data, which includes both financial data and operating data for certain types of issuers, for example, airports or hospitals. And then below that, economic data. For example, poorly trending unemployment, population, or income statistics are arguably quite material to an investment decision. Below that, we have risk factors, and these risk factors are actually input into the system on a client-by-client basis by your compliance department, so that these are customizable for risks that you believe are important to understand when an investor is making the buy or sell decision. These are both general in nature as well as sector-specific based on the bonds being reviewed. Heading back to the top of the municipal bond report, we provide the financial advisor or other user with the ability to forward this bond report on, either through email or by printing the bond report itself. It's important to note that this municipal bond report is fully customizable in terms of being able to pull out particular modules within the bond report or reorder them based on your preference. As your financial advisors access and use our platform, their actions are being recorded. This goes well beyond the traditional check-the-box attestation approach. This will allow your compliance professionals to determine who delivered what reports to whom, ensuring consistent compliance, proper disclosure to your clients, and protection for your firm. Now what I'd like to do is switch over briefly and show you a demonstration of the compliance reporting engine. Whether you're doing this for ongoing supervisory procedures or in response to an arbitration claim or examiner request. Our compliance report starts with basic parameters with respect to the report. For example, the date range during which actions were completed. The level at which you want to do your reporting. Perhaps it's on a branch level or perhaps it's on a user level. We can then proceed to our advanced parameters. For example, you may want to see all activity related to a particular CUSIP or related to a particular issuer. Or perhaps you want to generate a report on all healthcare related bonds that are floating rate in nature. Perhaps you want to generate a report based on those issuers that did not make a financial filing during a certain period of time, or are within a particular rating range, or where potential conflicts may exist. Any of these are fair game in terms of the ability to generate a compliance report of actions. I've just generated a brief compliance report focused on a particular branch. What you'll see is that there's an ability to save the report, create a PDF, export the content to Excel, etc. Another feature that we provide is the ability to actually go back and access the historical bond report that actually was generated by the financial advisor at the time of the action. This concludes our brief demonstration of the Diver platform. We thank you so much for your time and consideration. And at this point, we're going to move to the Q&A portion of our webinar.
We will now begin addressing your IM chat questions. Please type them in the pane.
Great, thank you. It looks like our first question that we have is around the effective date of the regulation. And again, as mentioned earlier, the effective date is July 5th. That is a Saturday, so I guess prior to July 4th weekend, you'll want to make sure you have your I's dotted and T's crossed around this rule. See, the next question that we have is, do you believe that Rule G-47 introduces anything new? And so I'm going to read your question carefully because it says, do I believe, or do you believe that G-47 introduces anything new? I will say, based on the commentary that I've seen or the feedback that I've seen submitted in response to the rule itself, perhaps. If you were asked to ask the MSRB and ask FINRA, I guess, they would say no. The MSRB specifically in the sense that they have made clear that the rule is indeed a codification I think what you are seeing with this rule is a couple of things. One is the effort and attempt to put clarity around an area that became muddied as a result of perhaps the 30 or so interpretive guidance and previously issued letters that were in response to market participant requests. If you go back earlier in our presentation, when we talked about the idea of, for example, that the rule applies to both sales to and purchase from, I think the purchase from was a significant surprise to many in the marketplace, perhaps not to the person who posed the question. Similarly, whether on the primary or secondary trade. So I think each of these are not new, but I think important clarifications. The other point that I'd like to mention is, again, this idea of what's reasonably accessible. If you go back to when G-17 was introduced, or go back to 2010 when Regulatory Notice 1041 and the MSRB reminders came out, and you compare material information that was reasonably accessible then to what is now, and I think the important there is what's reasonably accessible. I think that again is important. So I think the short of it is no, there's nothing new technically, but I think there is a fair amount that's important to digest and a fair amount that's been clarified, so that the response which we've heard when talking to some of the folks, which is, oh, I wasn't really sure it was buried in an interpretive notice or a letter, that is no longer going to be, I think, from what we understand, an acceptable response. The next question is, what's the retention on reports generated in the compliance search engine? I'm going to turn the response to that over to Tim Stevens.
Sure, thanks, Greg. So our retention policy is really in line with the policy of our client. So these reports are retained on a client-specific basis. So whatever your retention policy is with respect to the reports, we adhere to.
There is one other question with regard to FINRA's Regulatory Notice 1041 and whether that will remain effective. And the answer is that, as best we understand from conversations with FINRA, that when G-47 becomes effective and exams are done, and if there are issues, that the rule itself will be cited, but that the rule itself should be consistent in many, if not most, all respects with 1041. So I don't believe that 1041 goes away, but I think the operative and important aspect or rule to think about is G-47 on a prospective basis and what it requires, because that is indeed the rule. I think we are, unless we have any other questions, we do have one more. So the question that comes in next is, when a bond report is sent from Diver Advisor, is it sent through our email or that of Lumesis? So our email would be your client email. Again, I'll turn that over to Tim Stevens to address that.
Sure. Thanks, Greg. So all bond reports that are delivered via email are delivered by our client's servers and our client's email software. It does not go through our servers. We provide the municipal bond report. It is put into the form of a PDF and attached automatically to the email shell that is really coming from the client's server and then delivered through our client systems.
And I'll just add, this was a very important aspect of when we designed and developed the product, and speaking with market participants and being able to effectively deploy something without reaching behind their firewall, which for technology and otherwise security purposes is very important. We do have one other question. Does G-47 impact discretionary accounts? I think we briefly touched on this, and I apologize if I went over it very quickly. And the answer is yes. Not necessarily in the context that there is an absolute disclosure obligation to go right to the client, but certainly from the idea of the suitability standpoint in terms of making sure that the information was reviewed and contemplated in terms of supporting your suitability determination. So we think the answer is yes. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the other thing I'll add is that we're seeing our clients during implementation set up the system in such a way that they are recording the actions, whether for a discretionary account or not, and they just have a different way of dealing with that, so they're able to select a button that's essentially saved for compliance, meaning they're not delivering the report to the retail buyer of the security, but they're simply saving the report in the database. As these are the items that the financial advisor looked at and reviewed prior to doing the trade for their client.
Great. We'll give folks another minute or so if you have any further questions. Be happy to respond. For those of you that are shy, both Tim and my email are on the cover sheet of the presentation, which you can see right now. They'll also, again, be delivered to you. Please feel free to reach out, email, give us a call. We are both available, as well as the rest of our team, to address any questions you have or to perhaps further explore Diver. And with that, I will say that we are out of questions from you. And our presentation with that concludes. We want to thank everyone for taking from your schedule, and we look forward to the opportunity to speak with you or work with you going forward. Thank you.